The first report from a review into Oxford Community Schools released. It says they're doing some things right, but more needs to be done. So do those suggestions go far enough? Attorney Ven Johnson and a local former superintendent debate starting now. And time now to let it rip with attorney Ven Johnson, who's representing victims and survivors in the civil suits over the shooting, as well as former Madison High School District Superintendent Randy Speck, who also had a child in Oxford schools, and of course, Fox 2 anchor and attorney Charlie Langton. Good to see all of you. Thanks for joining us today. So we have this new report that you have in front of you that just came out that has basically, hey, these are the best practices, the improvements that Oxford Schools has made after the shooting. Let's look at some of the talking points over here about what they say they created. They said they created a centralized reporting system. Good, right? Developing intervention options, training staff on threat and suicide assessments, and giving students immediate access to counselor and mental health pros. When you take a look at all of this, first of all, Ven, these are things that some people would say should have been in place before the shooting. Are these essentials that should have been there before?
Well, the answer is of course, but what you also see in this 179-page report is although the best practices are currently being used, and I put that in air quotes, sorry folks, but you see that they're still not doing enough, even with the best practices. And the report goes on to talk about all the things that still need to be done that weren't being done, such as in 2 out of 44 cases that were being investigated. This is after the shooting. After the shooting with the new policies, suicide intervention teams only reported asking about guns and firearms 2 times out of 44, Charlie, I know you saw this. And then in threat assessment, meaning where they're not threatening suicide but outwardly threatening other people, 3 times out of 20 they asked about guns. Add those two together, folks, 5 times out of 64, 8% of the time group after all this happened, and they still don't ask about guns. What are these great procedures if you're not smart enough to ask about a gun that created this tragedy?
Randy, when you hear that right now, looking at that small percentage, 8%, ask about the gun. Don't you think that's one of the basics?
Yeah, it is. And every day I drop my daughter off and she goes into Oxford High School. And when she goes in, I believe she's safe. I go in because I know those teachers. I know folks that are in there. And I believe they're taking care of those students. I talk to teachers that I work with all the time down in Hamtramck and in Detroit schools. And one of the things that they worry about from time to time, and we are moving people past this because we have to. You have to ask about guns. You have to look in lockers. You have to do reasonable searches from time to time. You have to get police involved, and we're past the days of worrying about whether or not we hurt anyone's feelings, right?
But Randy, when you hear that 8% mark there, when it comes to asking about guns, you're sending your child there every day. Does that concern you?
Well, it does. There's probably a bigger picture to all of it, and I'm not in that particular building, and I'm not with in those particular conversations. I'm in other conversations though that I see with teachers and with students in other schools. And I see the kind of work that they do to make sure that our kids are safe.
But on that point, this report was done after the shooting, the tragic shooting, okay? So you got 8%, 9 months after. What were the percentage of asking about guns before the shooting?
Well, that report's coming out.
Well, we know what
that report's going to be. Less than 8%.
We know what it was on 11/29 and 11/30. It was zero.
It was zero.
And if they'd done that one thing, guys, and here's the let's say Ethan Crumley lied to them, then go to the next page of this report. Again, has nothing to do with the shooting, they say, because new policies, everything's better. How about this? In every single instance where there's a threat assessment, again, outward threats and suicide, get the SRO. That's the absolute security resource.
Right,
the person with a gun. There were 2 of them on site. And don't forget the liaison officer, Officer Leward, from Oakland County Sheriff Department, not in the building at the time, but was there that day. All 3 have guns. They didn't even bring him in. So what does this report say? Oh, yeah, in every one of these from now on, look for guns, ask for guns, and by the way, bring in the people with the guns.
Randy, does it concern you that till this day, even though we know that in Ethan Crumley's backpack was a gun, we know that he had those pictures that were discovered, he sent to the office, right? And then when they go to the office, say, all right, go back to class. and in that backpack was a gun. Right now, today in Oxford, they're not searching backpacks when a student walks in the door. Is that upsetting?
Well, they're searching backpacks from the standpoint of their AI evolved system that goes through. All the students, again, when I drop my daughter off every day, they all have clear backpacks. They're walking through. Are there some who are getting through? I don't know. But they're all walking through. All of those, they've got 3 different of the evolved systems, and they're all going through those systems. I've gone through that system. That system is designed to detect firearms and things like that. So from a standpoint of a safety standpoint, do I feel like my daughter's safe from that technology standpoint? I do. It's always going to be whether or not we as individuals are taking time to ask additional questions from counselors. Listen, from Columbine on, we've had 380 school shootings in this country. 355,000 students have been affected by gunfire in our schools in those last 20-plus years. Again, we are past the day of not being able to ask questions. We have to ask questions.
Well, you got to make people uncomfortable, but I mean in terms of searching the backpack, we know that you get someone who's angry, who's unstable, they're going to go out of their way to try to do something to hurt people when they want to. Not just in Oxford, everywhere. Should more be done in schools right now, Ven, in terms of searching through those backpacks, not allowing certain backpacks to come in at all, whether they're clear or not?
Well, the sad reality is, yes, we need more. And Randy just made a great point, and that is we need this training. And this is one of the things the report also talks about, guys, is we need training for threat assessment and suicide for everybody, staff members, teachers, teachers, coaches, cafeteria workers, custodians. Why? We drop our kids off, and that's where they stay for the next 8 hours. Everyone needs to know, but more importantly, the report also says everyone needs to be searched who's having a threat assessment or a suicide assessment, just like Ethan Crumley.
But how does a threat assessment, I want to ask you from a legal point of view, what does a threat assessment really look like? And then from an educational point of view, I want to ask you, Randy, what does it look like? Because I'm curious to know whether or not that threat assessment was in place, whether or not Ethan Crumley would get through.
Okay. Ben. On that day, they believed Ethan Crumley was a suicide risk. A high suicide risk is how they testified in their preliminary exam of the criminal. And then, of course, in my civil deposition, they weren't worried about anything at all. So we'll leave that there. But the fact of the matter is they were doing a suicide assessment. That's where they went that day. And what it does, the answer is legally, Rube, it doesn't matter. If you talk to the experts, when you're talking about outwardly threats of violence versus inward threat of violence, suicide, there's a thin line between where somebody can go. You still need to look at a backpack.
But if you're going to hurt yourself, if you're willing to hurt yourself, wouldn't you in some cases be willing to hurt others? Randy, does it concern you in terms of the threat assessment that's now being asked to be put in place, that's in place now in Oxford? What does that look like from an educational point of view, and do you think it's enough?
Well, do you know this entire conversation, we haven't mentioned math or science or reading. We haven't mentioned social studies. We haven't mentioned any of the educational parts, because all of a sudden that becomes secondary. We're just finishing M-STEP testing here in the state. All of that becomes secondary because of the things that we're asking our teachers to do. Yes, we're asking our teachers, we're asking our students to keep their eyes open. See something, say something. We're asking them to come into classrooms.
The reality is that students in these schools are afraid, especially after all these shootings. So we can't get to the math and the merits of what they're supposed to learn.
It's our new reality. I'm not saying that it's not.
But I wouldn't poo-poo the report, though. I think this report is actually very good. There are very good assessments that are made. We need now in this world to talk about threat assessments and analyze them to eliminate or minimize, can't eliminate, but minimize the risk.
But we have to be right every time, right? Because we have to be right every time. And every parent deserves us to be right every time. They deserve for us to ask additional questions. They deserve for that teacher, when they are trying to do their academic subjects and to teach, to recognize if a kid needs
what does threat assessment look like moving forward in this terrible world that these kids have to grow up in? What does it look like from an academic point of view?
Well, from an education standpoint, it means we have threat assessment teams. We have people, we have social workers, we have more mental health professionals.
They look out for students who seem troubled? How does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. They're getting referred. They're having conversations. They're having conversations with parents. They're having conversations with mental health professionals. You know, it was just recently in the state of Michigan that you could have a qualified mental health professional who could have their own private practice, but they couldn't work in schools. Now those things have changed because we realize we need the need.
The overarching question that, from a legal point of view, Charlie and Ben, I'd like you to chime in on this, is the fact that the Attorney General offered to do an investigation on Oxford. Twice, and the school district said, no thank you, we're going to hire Guidepost, which is an outside company.
It's not what they said, Rube. They made him wait for 9 months. They made him wait for 9 months, and then they decided, after all this public absolute outrage, which the public should have been, and I give everybody in Oxford credit for not listening to this nonsense, because the insurance company for the school district dictated what to do and what not to do by way of a threat that if you don't listen to what we tell you to do, then we will not pay you. We will not pay any judgment or settlement or anything. It's called a cooperation clause.
They don't have to pay anything now anyway. Just throw your case out.
Well, Charlie, the new report's coming out later on this summer. The new report is not going to be about what has been done, but what happened before and during the shooting. Is this going to be a bombshell?
Yeah, I think it is. Actually, I think it is, yes. And I think you're going to see that whatever threat assessment exists in this report, I think it's going to be minimized to almost zero. And I think that that's going to, Ven Johnson of the world will love that one. Now, whether he can do this legally, I think we're going to need a change of the law. Because I think you have a school district that is now in this land now. We know about threat assessments. We know to analyze the risk. There's been data. And if a school district doesn't do that, I think there's going to be an exception to governmental immunity that'll probably be carved out, and this will be the new gross negligence that will be more, and it'll put the school district on notice, and they're going to have to pay.
Randy, does this report put a parent's mind to ease at all?
I don't know that it does. I mean, there's not been a case of any of those school shootings that I mentioned that it didn't completely destroy and divide a town. It has changed Oxford forever, right? And so parents want to feel safe. They want to have a report that says everything's being done every day, all the time for all of our students. And, you know, when we send our kids to school every day, we are believing and wanting to believe that that's happening.
Randy, we thank you for your time today. We hope that you both will come back and talk about the next report that comes out that says what happened before the shooting and after the shooting. Ven Johnson, thank you very much for your time as well.